Hello and welcome to CodeSlicing. In this quick yet exciting tip, we're going to be looking at how to reliably add shadows and other effects to a view. Now, you might immediately be thinking that the answer is obvious and that you just add the appropriate modifier to that view. But oftentimes, it's not as simple as that, so stick around if you want to know more. What we've got on our hands here is a like button. Very similar in concept to the like button under this video, so hit that if you want to see how a like button works, as well as making me very happy in the process. The implementation probably won't shock you in the slightest, so I won't go into too much detail about it, and the source will be in the description if you'd like to check it out. But this is a pretty classic case. We're constructing this button with a layered approach, and these layers have an alpha or opacity associated with them. Let's say we wanted to add a shadow. So naturally, we modify our button with the shadow modifier. I'll give it a slightly darker shade of grey than the default so you can see it clearly, and give it a radius of 5. And can you see what happens? The SF symbol we're using gets the shadow applied as well as the background. This is almost always not what you want to happen, since these kind of design elements belong in the button implementation itself, not when adding a shadow to the overall view. This is happening because the shadow modifier goes through the hierarchy tree and places shadows on everything it can. As far as I'm aware, there are 3 ways of solving this problem, so let's take a look at them from worst to best. The first way you can combat this is by adding a shadow to something that is the same shape as the view as a background to that view, thereby limiting the shadow modifier's influence. And as you can see, this method works effectively in this case. However, there are a couple of downsides. Firstly, you need to know the shape of the view. This might not always be obvious and can get tricky or downright impossible if the button has a bespoke shape. In addition, the view, in this case a button, but obviously could be any view, could very well change size when clicked or for any other reason, and accounting for that using this technique isn't something I would recommend attempting. Secondly, notice that the opacity of the shadow is not related to the opacity of the view. See how the button fades between pressed and non-pressed states? The shadow should obey this change in opacity as well, and the result of this approach does not do that, so it looks a bit weird. At a push, you can use this technique, but we have better ways, which brings us to our next approach, and that is to put the view in a drawing group and add a shadow after that. This looks promising and works a lot of the time, and the reason it works is that when you modify a view with a drawing group, the view hierarchy is flattened and rasterized to a bitmap, which is then used in place of the view. Adding a shadow therefore works just as you would expect. Notice also that as I click, the opacity of the view affects the opacity of the shadow, which is just what we want. There are also rendering performance improvements to be gained here, but while this gives us the result we're looking for, there are 2 potential problems with this approach. Firstly, you can no longer interact with the view's contents. What I mean by that is, if you have a text field in there, it simply will not work. And if you don't believe me, here's one I made earlier showing that when I try to apply the drawing group modifier to a view containing a text field, the result is less than ideal. So this certainly isn't an option in this case. Secondly, the drawing group rasterization will be restricted to the frame of the view being modified. In this case, that's no problem since nothing steps over the boundary. But let's add a stroke to the button by adding a bigger circle as a background to the first one. And look at that, the stroke is cut off at the border. So what's the best approach? I'm very glad you asked, and you've come to the right place for the answer, which is to use the compositing group modifier. This fantastic modifier lets us have our cake and eat it too. You can think of it as flattening an image in Photoshop, but rather than a bitmap, we have a view on our hands that works just like any other view. Nothing is cut off at the borders, and you can interact with text fields or whatever it is you want to do. And this doesn't just work for shadows. It's also useful with blend modes, blurs, and opacity modifiers, to name a few. Let's take a look at a quick example where I've got an Oculus icon consisting of a white capsule over a black one. If I add an opacity modifier to this Z stack, take a look at what happens. Are you surprised? This kind of thing can really throw you for a loop in SwiftUI if you're not ready for it. Intuitively, we would expect the white in the middle to stay white since it's on a white background and we're just reducing its opacity. What's actually happening is that it's applying the opacity to each capsule individually, meaning that we can see some of the black capsule coming through the white one. Adding a compositing group modifier solves this problem and we get the behavior we're expecting. There are many cases in SwiftUI where you can find that views behave in strange ways when applying effects to them. It often comes down to this kind of behavior. So I hope this has forearmed you with the knowledge needed for a potential solution before firing up Stack Overflow. Let me know if that helped by hitting the like button if you didn't do it before, and subscribe for more if this kind of content floats your boat. If you have any questions, comments or suggestions, please leave them below. But in the meantime, thanks for joining me. See you next time.